So here's another one that you should recognize. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. This, again, is a style of narration which has kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of commercial fantasy. There is, sorry, Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice is obviously what this is from, but this has a very distinct narrative voice that the irony and the dryness of the humor that is just dripping through this. And yes, I appreciate dryness and dripping, don't really go together as natural sort of descriptors, but it is a truth universally acknowledged. So this claim to a universal truth when we know that no, this is not universal, this is not even true. And the person that they're talking about, the man, may not even be aware of this. So it's hardly universal and it's certainly not true. That a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And so if you have money and you're a man, then you must want a wife. You must need a wife because you have a fortune. Therefore, you need someone to spend it for you. There is so much in this about the social compact of the day, about social expectations of the day. And these expectations that are an agreed upon set of rules known only to an elite few or a special few, where they think, yes, everyone knows this because all of us know it, but they've never talked to anyone else. They've never considered anyone else. They've assumed that their view of the world is the view of everyone. And again, I think this is a point that Austen makes that is very relevant to today's world. We get so caught up in our own, we call them echo chambers, but in sort of these circles where we gravitate towards people with certain views or expectations or approaches or preferences that mirror our own, so much so that a lot of our discourse, particularly because it's online, because we have access to this, we have the impression that this is widely held because we're talking to people across the world, that it is therefore universally held, and that we are actually representative of a much greater group. And we see this with a lot of fan discourse, when even if we take just a single moment to look at the responses, sometimes if you take something like Reddit, you post something in Reddit and you get a lot of people agreeing with you. You go, see, I am right. I am representative of the fans. And we have a tendency then to ignore or dismiss, even on a fan forum, the fans that disagree with us. We still see ourselves as representative and we see them as aberrant. We see them as different, as not being representative, because we see our views as a truth universally acknowledged. One of the great things about Austen's writing is this very dry wit, this humor that permeates all of her writing. It is extraordinary. Her voice, her narrator's voice, is powerful and so well established in this opening. And everything then is this knowing commentary on the world, this nod and a wink to the reader. And we've lost a lot of that subtlety. We've lost a lot of the desire in modern writing for these very strong narratorial voices. We want quite often a story to be as plainly rendered as possible without this color, without this tone, without this style. And the predominant, or one of the dominant forms that we're seeing in a lot of particularly commercial fiction is this perspex, window glass sort of style of writing that is very much about relaying what is there and letting the reader add things to it and not giving the reader color. And yet, while that has been around, it's been around since like the 1950s, it's not a new style. It has risen to become quite dominant Whereas something like this that has that very definitive voice, that strong narratorial voice, Dan has been around just as long, if not significantly longer. And it is, when we see it now, it seems to stand out more because we're just not used to it anymore. And yet, that powerful narrative voice can be so well done and so engaging. And because it's so rare now, it stands out as something a bit different. But again, I think part of what we see in so many of these classic works is something that, yes, is focused on the time and society of its contemporary period. But there are many lessons from it. There are many approaches in it that are actually quite illuminating about our own period of history, about our own approaches to things. So that, just wanted to talk about that one because again, a modern day editor might say this is coming across as a very dominant in terms of the narrative voice. It's not letting the reader assume it. It's overpowering, and yet that's not what it is at all. It's quite subtle, but we're not used to reading it anymore. So I think that this is one of the things that's fallen out of favor. Interestingly, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series starts with a very similar sort of knowing nod and wink to the reader about the tone in which the paragraph about, is it Privet Drive, Privet, where the Dursleys live, how that is rendered. I think that first paragraph ends with "Thank you very much," which is this very classic clipped way of finishing off the sentence that gives you the tone with which it is meant to be read. And it fits very well with this sort of style that Austen has made so famous. But the next thing that I want to talk about, specifically in relation to this, is the type of language that Austen is using. Because if we look at this, it is a truth universally acknowledged. Think of the structure of that. It's not a universally acknowledged truth, it is a truth universally acknowledged. This is a very formal, to the modern ear, very awkward way of phrasing this, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, that this is a very formal register. And for the modern reader, who maybe isn't an Austen fan, this could be off-putting. But again, we see, as with Dickens, Austen is not afraid to use complex English, is not afraid to expand the bounds of what English can use. It's not about distilling it down to the most basic form of literature that is accessible to every single level of literacy. Her diction is aimed at an educated adult audience. Because even if the person was not able to read it personally, if they were listening to it, your hearing comprehension is generally, I said generally, not always, but is generally better than your reading comprehension. That quite often we pick up on context clues when we listen to something. And because of that, even if we are unfamiliar with the particular words, we get a sense of what they are meant to mean from context. This is a very similar skill to what we do when we read, but when we read, it is slightly different. It's not quite the same. It's based in the same skill set, but it is applied slightly differently. But again, Austen is unafraid of the English language. In fact, enjoys the English language and uses the language to establish this tone, to establish this register. Because if we rewrote this in more basic English, it wouldn't work as well. It wouldn't get across that sense of the prim and proper high society that is overly formal and worried about the forms and worried about formality. If it was in a basic register, that wouldn't come across. If it was written in an informal patois or Creole, or if it was written in informal everyday speech that wasn't as grammatically formal, that would create a very different sense. And so, again, paying attention not only to the words being used, the order with which the words are relayed, all of this adds to the tone. And that tone is integral to understanding what is being said in the text. If we were being very, very literal, it's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Oh, right. So everyone knows that if you're an unmarried man and you have money, you must need a wife. That would be the literal reading, but that's not what we are being told here. The structure of the sentences, the tone of the sentences, these things are telling us that we are to doubt this. And therefore, it is the antithesis of the literal reading of the text. And this is such an important lesson. I've illustrated it before by saying, we do this all the time when someone says, it's not you, it's me. Literal readings can really throw you off if you just believe what is said in the text is true. Then you're not going to get this book. You won't. You have to be able to understand irony, sarcasm, dry wit, these things that are communicated through tone. And tone is very hard to establish with the written word because we can't hear it. And so authors come up with techniques, conceits, ways of doing things to convey tone to help the reader to understand. And that is a very important aspect of writing. Now, it has greater or lesser importance depending on the style of narrative. But in something like this, it's incredibly important. And so, again, this would be one of those things that I would point to when people say, oh, I don't care about the prose. The prose doesn't matter. It's the story that's important. The prose can be incredibly important because tone, register, diction, all of these things are established through word choice and the grammar of the sentences, syntax, how paragraphs are put together. It is absolutely essential to the understanding of literature. Now, it may not be absolutely essential to the understanding of your particular favorite book because it's all going to be dependent on the individual narrative and the style of narration and the type of book that you are reading.